Wyoming Territory, October 1883. The wind howled through the valley as Gideon Vaughn shoved the barn door open, pitchfork in hand and jaw set tight against the cold. He was halfway through hauling hay when something moved in the shadows near the stalls. His boots froze in the straw. A soft groan echoed under the rafters. He stepped closer and found her crumpled in the hay, half covered in dust and snow. A woman, pale, unconscious, breathing shallow. Her dress was torn at the hem, heavy with road dust. A small carpetbag lay beside her, clasp barely holding. "Hell," Gideon muttered, tossing the pitchfork aside. He knelt and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Warm. Alive. He lifted her gently, careful with her arm that looked twisted wrong, and carried her across the yard. The wind bit harder now, cutting through his coat as he kicked open the cabin door. The fire was out, but the embers still glowed. He set her down on the cot and tossed a log onto the hearth. As the flames caught, he knelt beside her. She looked young, maybe 20. Her cheeks flushed with fever, lips cracked. He poured water into a cup, touched it to her mouth. She stirred barely. Her eyes fluttered open, blue, clear but dazed. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're gonna be all right." Her lips parted. "Zadie, my name's Zadie. I'm Gideon Vaughn. You're on my land about 3 miles outside Bitter Creek." He hesitated. "What happened?" Her eyes filled, but she blinked hard. I thought this was the address. I had it in my pocket. I was supposed to meet. I was supposed to get married." He sat back on his heels, stunned. "You're a mail-order bride," she nodded once. "He never came." "I waited 2 days at the depot until they told me he'd left town 6 weeks ago. I had nowhere else. I walked. I must have gotten turned around." Gideon stood slowly, his mind racing. He never wanted marriage. Had made that real clear to his neighbors, to his sister back east who kept writing about nice girls. He liked his quiet, his land, his horses. That was enough, but this woman had nearly died in his barn. "You need rest. You're not going anywhere tonight," he said. "You can stay here for now." Zadie tried to sit up but winced. He caught her gently by the shoulders and eased her back. "I was born in Kansas," she murmured. "But after Ma passed, I took care of my little brother. Then he got sick. I had nothing left there. Thought maybe I could start again." Gideon stared into the fire. He knew that hollow place, the one where you buried people you loved and tried to live past it. He didn't say anything, just stood and grabbed an extra quilt from the chest and covered her with it. In the morning, he saddled his mare and rode into town for the doctor. By afternoon, Zadie's fever had broken. Her wrist was splinted, her color better. But she was quiet, withdrawn. She barely ate, and when she did, she sat at the far end of the table, hands folded tight in her lap. Gideon kept his distance, but he watched her. How she looked out the window like she was trying to gather her pieces. How she thanked him each time he brought her broth or filled the kettle. She never asked for more, never complained. On the 5th day, she stepped outside, arm still in the sling, and stood at the edge of the corral. The sky was wide and clear, and the wind had finally calmed. "I can leave soon," she said, not turning. "I do not want to be a bother." "You are not," Gideon said flatly. "I just need to find work. I can sew, clean. I will get out of your way." He leaned on the fence beside her. "Zadie, you collapsed in my barn. That is not something a person walks away from like it was nothing." She glanced at him then. "You never wanted a wife." His mouth tightened. "No. I didn't." "Then why are you being kind?" He looked at her, really looked. The soft strength in her jaw, the way her eyes held more fight than fear now, because someone should be. Days turned into weeks. Zadie stayed. She cooked simple meals, mended his shirts, swept the cabin floor without being asked. Gideon tried not to notice the way her laugh softened the corners of the room, or how her presence filled the silence he used to need. One morning he found her in the barn, brushing the old gelding with her good hand. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "I am fine. You were out late with the calving. I thought I could start something." "You are not a servant." Her eyes met his. "Then what am I, Gideon?" That question hung in the air, thick and hard. He stepped closer. "I do not know yet, but I know you are not leaving." "Why?" "Because every time you walk into a room, it feels like something settled in me I did not even know was missing." Her breath caught. "You told me once you never wanted marriage." He looked down, then up again. "I said that before you." Zadie blinked, her hand still resting on the horse's withers. "And now, I am not saying anything you do not want to hear, but I would like you to stay. Not because you need to. Because you want to." The horse shifted between them, but neither moved. Zadie reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his. "If I stayed, would it be enough, just me?" His throat tightened. "More than enough." She stepped closer. "Then I will stay." He leaned in, kissed her softly, hand against her cheek. It was not rushed. It was not unsure. It was the kind of kiss that told the truth without needing a single word. And Gideon Vaughn, the man who never wanted marriage, held her like he had just found every last piece he never knew he had lost. By late November, the first snow held to the ground. The prairie grass vanished beneath a crust of frost, and the horses huddled close to the barn each night. Gideon rose early, as always, but now there was a second cup on the table and a shawl draped over the chair nearest the stove. Zadie no longer kept to the edges of the room. She moved with quiet confidence, her arm nearly healed, her fingers quick with needle and thread. The mended curtains hung straighter. His shirts fit better. But more than that, the cabin felt lived in, like she'd poured something of herself into the walls without speaking a word of it. One morning, Gideon came in from checking fence posts to find her kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a flame from kindling with a steady hand. Her face was flushed with heat, a streak of ash on her cheek. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked, unbuttoning his coat. She sat back on her heels. "To what?" He hung the coat on its peg. "Family, maybe, old friends." Zadie shook her head. "There's no one left to write to, let alone go back for. I thought I might miss it, but I don't. Not the smoke, not the noise. Not the way people looked at me after my brother passed, like I was something to feel sorry for." Gideon leaned against the doorframe. "You don't look sorry anymore." "I'm not." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "I'm grateful." "That's different." He watched her turn toward the window, eyes following the wind that peeled across the snowfields. Something in her had steadied, like the ground after a long storm. Later that week, she brought a ledger from the storage chest and laid it on the table between them. "I've been keeping track," she said, "of what we've got, what's running low. You've enough dried beans to feed a regiment, but flour's thin, and the roof's got a leak near the stove pipe." Gideon folded his arms. "You've been climbing on the roof." "No," she said dryly. "But I've been catching water in a pan since Wednesday." He broke into a low chuckle, the first in days. "I'll patch it tomorrow." She nodded, satisfied, and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "If you're going into town next week, I could ride with you. There's a woman at the mercantile who said they need help with bookkeeping." "You're planning to earn your keep." "I'm planning to stay useful." He studied her. "You don't have to prove anything." "I know," she said, voice even, "but I've spent too long being seen as somebody's burden. I'd like to be seen as somebody's partner." That word settled into him like warm, iron solid, undeniable. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he reached across the table, hand covering hers. "I don't take lightly to promises," he said, "but if I give one, I stand by it." She didn't pull away. "Then give me one that's true." "I won't ask you to be less than you are. Not ever." The next morning they hitched the wagon and rode into Bitter Creek. The town bustled with the start of winter trade. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of a hammer echoed from the farrier's shop. As they passed the church, Zadie glanced at the front steps, where a pair of boys built a snow fort with gloveless hands. "Did you ever go to services?" she asked. "Used to," Gideon said. "Not since Pa passed. He was the one who kept to it." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'd like to go next time, not for the sermons. For the singing." He gave her a sidelong glance. "You sing, not well," she admitted, "but I remember the hymns. My mother had a voice like silver, said those songs could carry a soul if it was tired enough." His grip on the reins tightened. "Maybe we'll try it next Sunday." They left the wagon near the general store. While Zadie stepped inside to speak with the shopkeeper's wife, Gideon walked to the blacksmith's to place an order for a new axle pin. When he returned, she was standing by the window, a folded paper in her hand. "Mrs. Layton says they'll hire me for 2 days a week. Ledger copying, inventory, paid in coin and credit both." He studied her expression. There was pride there, but something else too, something softer. "I said yes," she added. "If that's all right with you. I'd be a fool to stand in your way." Zadie smiled but didn't look away. "I want to be the kind of woman who builds something, not just survives." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You already are." That night, the wind picked up again, scattering dry snow across the yard. Inside the cabin, she lit a second lamp and sat at the table, pen scratching paper in quiet rhythm. Gideon watched her from the stove, arms crossed, the smell of pine smoke curling around them. She looked up once, catching his gaze. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "Just thinking how I got used to the quiet, thought I needed it." Zadie tilted her head, waiting. "But now," he said, "I can't imagine this place without your voice in it." She rose and crossed to him, her hand resting just over his heart. "Then don't." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. They stood like that for a long while, the room warm, the wind forgotten, the fire steady as her breath against his collar. A week before Christmas, Gideon stood beneath a pale morning sky, hammering the last cedar plank into place along the south side of the barn. The cold bit through his gloves, but the work kept his hands busy and his thoughts clear. Behind him, the low rumble of Zadie's voice drifted from the corral, where she was coaxing the yearling colt to accept a halter. She spoke softly, not with commands but patience, like she was learning his rhythms instead of forcing her own. The colt hadn't let anyone near him since his dam died in the spring. Gideon had stopped trying months ago. Now, from the corner of his eye, he watched as the animal stepped forward and brushed its nose against her palm. Later, back inside, Zadie rinsed a pot at the wash basin while he stacked another log on the fire. The scent of spruce clung to his coat. "I've been thinking about the back room," she said, drying her hands. "It's not much, but if we cleared it out, it could be something more." He looked over his shoulder. "More what? A space for sewing, maybe, or writing. I used to keep a little journal back before I left Kansas. I'd like to start again." Gideon wiped his hands on a cloth. "You want a place that's yours." "I want to put down something I can return to, something quiet." He nodded once. "Then we'll clear it tomorrow." That night, snow fell steady and soft, piling past the window ledge. Inside, Gideon sat at the table, sorting through a box of bent nails and rusted hinges. Zadie unfolded a scrap of muslin and began stitching a simple hem, her foot tucked beneath her chair. "I saw the preacher in town," she said. "He asked if we'd be attending the Christmas gathering." Gideon didn't look up. "You want to go?" "I think I do." He set the nail aside. "I haven't been to a gathering in years." "I know." She paused, threading the needle again. "But maybe it's time we let folks see we're not just sharing a roof." He leaned back, studying her. "You think we need their approval?" "No," she said gently. but I think it might be good to let them know I chose to stay, that it wasn't pity on your part or desperation on mine." He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go." On Christmas Eve, Zadie wore a dark blue dress she'd sewn from cloth Mrs. Layton had given her at the store. She'd added a collar of white lace, uneven but careful. Gideon wore the coat his father had passed down, the cuffs mended by her hand. They rode into town in silence, the road muffled by snow. Lanterns glowed in the church windows, and the sound of a fiddle spilled out into the cold. Inside, the air was warm with pine boughs and the scent of bread. Children darted between pews, and women passed plates of biscuits and jam. Gideon stood near the back, hat in hand, while Zadie greeted Mrs. Layton and helped hang coats. When the singing started, she eased into the row beside him and folded her hands in her lap. The hymns rose like breath in winter clear, simple, full of something old and steady. Halfway through the gathering, the preacher called for couples to come forward and light candles for the season's blessings. Gideon hesitated, but Zadie reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. They stepped forward together, and she held the taper while he lit it from the altar flame. The light flickered, catching in her eyes. She didn't look away afterward. They stood beneath the church awning, breath misting in the air. "You all right?" she asked. He looked out at the snow-covered road. "I keep waiting for it to feel strange. Like I'm in someone else's life." She touched his arm. "And does it?" "No," he said. "It feels like it's finally mine." They rode home in quiet again, but this time it was the kind that settled deep, the kind that didn't need filling. That night, they stood together in the back room, the one they'd cleared just that morning. The walls were bare, but the floor was swept clean, and a small oil lamp flickered on the windowsill. Zadie stepped in first, her hand brushing the edge of the door frame. "It's not much," she said. "It's yours," Gideon replied. "Ours if you want it." She turned to him, her face shadowed but sure. "I do." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple band forged from horseshoe iron and polished smooth. He didn't kneel, just held it out in his palm. "I never thought I'd say this," he said, "but I want to build something with you, not just the land. A life." Zadie took the ring, her breath catching. Then she slipped it on her finger, slow and deliberate. "I didn't come here looking for love," she said. "But I found it all the same." He drew her close, forehead to hers, the lamp casting long shadows behind them. Outside, the wind had quieted. Snow rested on the roof like a final blessing. And inside, the warmth between them held steady, earned, certain, and deeply, quietly theirs. The cold deepened through January, settling into the bones of the land. Frost edged the cabin windows each morning, delicate as lace, and the creek behind the barn froze solid enough to hold a wagon. Gideon rose before light each day and came in with the smell of cedar and iron clinging to his coat, boots heavy with snow. Zadie had taken to waking just after him. Not to cook, he'd insisted she stay warm, but to start the fire and warm his gloves on the stove before he stepped back out. They hadn't spoken of a wedding since the ring. No need. They moved together now with a quiet rhythm, two parts of the same pulse. But the world outside hadn't stopped turning, and with it came the inevitable letter. Gideon returned from Bitter Creek one evening with his hat pulled low and a folded envelope tucked between his fingers. He laid it on the table beside the oil lamp without a word. Zadie glanced up from the quilt square in her lap and waited. "It's from my sister in Ohio," he said, voice low. "She'd written months back before you came. Kept pushing to send someone out here to help me." Zadie's needle paused. "You never told me you had a sister." He rubbed a hand along the back of his neck. "Didn't seem urgent. We haven't been close since Ma died. She married a banker, lives in Cincinnati now, wants me to sell off the land, claims I'm wasting myself out here." Zadie set the square aside. "Are you considering it?" His eyes met hers steady. "No, but I reckon she'll be coming anyway. Says she's boarding the train in February." The lamp flame flickered as the wind pressed against the door. Zadie stood and crossed to the stove, lifting the kettle to pour hot water into a basin. The silence between them wasn't strained, it just carried the weight of something unspoken. "I won't be sent off," she said finally, her voice clear. "Not politely, not otherwise." Gideon pushed the envelope aside. "You're not going anywhere. She won't expect me. A woman like her, she'll see someone like me and think I'm some kind of charity case. She won't see you at all if she can't look past her own pride," he said. "But I'll make it plain. You belong here." Zadie didn't answer at first. She dipped a cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and folded it across the table to cool his hands. "I don't need her to like me," she said, "but I need her to see that I chose this." "She will," he said, "or she won't. Either way, it changes nothing." February came hard and fast, dragging storm after storm across the plains. The day Clara Vaughn stepped off the train in Bitter Creek, the clouds hung heavy and the wind cut sharp out of the northeast. She was wrapped in a fur-collared coat, boots polished and impractical, and her gaze missed nothing. Zadie offered her hand before Gideon could speak. "Zadie Vaughn," she said evenly. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory." Clara hesitated, then took her hand briefly. "I expected to see a housekeeper," she said, "not a wife." Gideon's jaw tightened. "She's both and more." The ride to the homestead passed in brittle silence. Clara took in the snow-covered fields, the modest barn, the cabin tucked beneath a rise of cottonwoods. Her expression never softened. Inside, Gideon stoked the fire while Zadie prepared coffee. Clara stepped carefully around the room, eyes touching each detail: the mended curtains, the worn rug, the stack of ledgers near the hearth. "I thought you'd be raising cattle," she said. "Not living like a trapper." "I raise horses," Gideon replied, "and I live the way I want." Clara turned to Zadie. "And you, what did you do before this arrangement?" Zadie handed her the coffee without flinching. "I buried my brother. Then I walked until I found something worth standing still for." Clara blinked, unsettled. "And this is worth it to you?" Zadie didn't smile. "Every day." That evening, as snow began to fall again, Clara stood at the window while Gideon and Zadie sat together at the table, their shoulders brushing each time one of them moved. They said little, but their ease was undeniable. "You've changed," Clara said finally, not turning. Gideon looked up. "Maybe. You used to talk about Boston, remember, about leaving this place behind. That was a long time ago." And now he reached for Zadie's hand, threading their fingers together. "Now I wake up with someone who sees me as I am and doesn't ask me to be what I'm not." Clara watched them a moment longer, then stepped away from the window and took a seat beside the fire. "I'll stay a week," she said. "Then I'll go back and tell Father you made your choice." Zadie didn't let go of Gideon's hand. "We both did." Clara didn't argue. She only nodded once and turned her gaze to the flames. That night, Gideon and Zadie lay beneath the quilt she'd been sewing all winter, the cabin quiet but for the wind against the eaves. He traced the curve of her hand against his chest, her breath warm at his collarbone. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm tired," she murmured. "But solid." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'll take solid, long as it's with you." She settled closer. "It is." And outside, the wind moved on, softer now, carrying only the hush of snow falling on a roof that finally truly held. By the time Clara left, the snow had begun to thin, and the wind lost its teeth. Gideon stood with Zadie at the edge of the yard, watching the wagon roll back toward the station. Clara hadn't hugged either of them, but she'd left behind a tin of lemon biscuits and a note folded neat inside Gideon's ledger: no apology, no blessing, Just a line about being more alike than they'd once believed. Zadie didn't open the tin. Instead, she turned to the pasture, where the first thaw had begun to show in patches of mud and golden grass. The horses had started to shed their winter coats. The rhythm of the land was shifting. That afternoon, Gideon laid fresh boards along the porch, and Zadie stitched a final border into the quilt she'd started months ago. When the sun dipped low, they sat together outside, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, the scent of smoke rising from the chimney behind them. "Do you ever think we should leave this place?" she asked softly. He looked out at the hills, the slow bend of the creek far off. "No, not for anything. I've already got everything worth staying for." She turned her face toward his, eyes catching the last of the light. "Then let's plant something this spring." Gideon raised a brow. "What kind of something?" "Anything that grows." She smiled, full, unguarded. "Something that says we meant to stay." When the ground softened enough to turn, they worked side by side behind the barn. Zadie brought out seeds she'd traded for in town: beans, squash, turnips, and tucked them into small cotton pouches. Gideon fenced off the plot with scrap wood and wire, his hands calloused and sure. They didn't talk much while they worked. The sound of the shovel biting soil was enough. By dusk, the rows were marked and Zadie's skirt was streaked to the hem with dirt. She brushed it off without fuss, watching the last light fall across the furrows they'd made. "That's a good start," Gideon said beside her. She nodded. "It feels like a promise." By early April, green pushed through the soil in neat lines. Zadie tended them in the mornings, her hands stained with earth, her shoulders bare to the sun under rolled sleeves. Gideon had taken to watching her from the barn roof, where he'd begun laying shingles to replace the ones winter had splintered. One evening, after the horses had been fed and the gate latched, she called to him from the porch. "There's a letter from Kansas." He wiped his hands on a rag and came up beside her. The envelope was thin, the ink faded. She unfolded it carefully, reading the lines once, then again. "It's from the family that took in my neighbor's boy after his parents died," she said. "They found the box I'd left with my brother's books, a few sketches he did." Gideon waited. "They wanted me to know they kept it safe, that they'd like to send it to me now if there's somewhere it belongs." He watched her face, the shadow of memory flickering there. "You want it?" he asked. "I think I do," she said. "Not to keep me in that time, just to remember that I came through it." The box arrived 3 weeks later, wrapped in twine, the wood worn but intact. Inside were 3 books, a tin of pencils, and a folded handkerchief with her brother's initials embroidered in blue. Zadie held it in her lap by the fire, her fingers tracing the stitches. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But when Gideon reached for her hand, she laced her fingers through his and held on. When the first fold dropped in late May, Zadie was the one who caught it. Gideon had been out setting fence posts along the far ridge, and by the time he rode in, she was kneeling in the straw, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the newborn resting against her thigh. "She's strong," Zadie said, not looking up. "Came out fast." Gideon stepped into the stall and crouched beside her. "You did good." "I didn't do it alone," she said, brushing damp hair from her face, "but I wasn't afraid." He cupped her cheek with one rough hand. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." They named the full willow after the tree that stood alone on the far hill. By summer, the garden had filled in with green, and the cabin had taken on a life that felt planted, not borrowed. One Sunday morning, under a sky the color of worn cotton, they rode into town. Not for supplies, not for anything pressing. Just to walk the dusty street, to let the world see what had been quietly, fiercely built between them. At the church steps, the preacher paused mid-sweeping and tipped his hat. "Fine to see you both," he said. Married folk always look different when it's right. Gideon glanced at Zadie. We never had it done proper. Zadie held his gaze. Not yet. They didn't plan a wedding. They didn't send word or gather neighbors. One morning in early June, they stood beneath the cottonwood behind the barn, with the preacher and his wife, and the scent of wild mint on the breeze. Zadie wore a dress she'd dyed from walnut hulls, and Gideon wore his father's coat. There was no ring exchange, they already had that. No music, no flowers. Just a few words, spoken low and certain. When the preacher said they could kiss, Gideon didn't hesitate. He kissed her like they were already 10 years in, like they'd weathered storms and come through clean. That night, they lay in the field behind the cabin, stars high over the cottonwoods, the air warm and still. I used to think I'd never belong to anything, Zadie whispered. You belong to me, Gideon said. And I belong to you. They lay there long after the moon rose, her head on his shoulder, his thumb brushing her wrist. The kind of quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was full, of everything past and everything still to come. Years later, the cottonwood still stood, and the garden grew deeper with each passing season. The foal grew into a broad-chested mare with a soft mouth, and the cabin walls held the weight of laughter, of long winters and slow mornings, of love that never had to announce itself to be known. And in that place, Gideon and Zadie built a life that held, rooted, quiet, and true.